Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ICRP webinar on lessons for radiological protection from the Chornobyl and Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accidents. As you all know, it was 40 years ago that the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident happened, and it was 15 years ago that the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident happened. And these days, there are quite some events dealing with those two accidents. Our event today is a bit special because we will focus on the radiological consequences for radiological protection. Of course, as we are the ICRP, the International Commission on Radiological Protection. In fact, since 40 years now, we as the ICRP, we are following the consequences of these events. We review health effects, we look at environmental and non-human biota impact, we look at social studies, and we think about the implication for the system of radiological protection. Now, today we have members from several committees of ICRP presenting. We have members from Committee 1, which is on effects, from Committee 2, which is on dosimetry, and Committee 4 on application of the system of radiological protection. Once we heard the presentations, after the presentations, we will have a moderated discussion among international organizations. And really, the central question to us is, are we really better prepared to protect people and the environment in the situation of radiological accidents? What have we learned, and have we learned enough from the past? So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. And with this, I would like to pass over to our first speaker or first speakers. They are both from the Ukraine, Oleg Nasvit from the Ukraine and his co-author Yuri Skaletsky. So dear colleagues from Ukraine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Oleg Nasvit. I am from Ukraine. Some sounds. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you should be good now.
Yeah, okay. This is just to remind the location of the NPP accident and the distance to Kiev, to Chernobyl, Pripyat city, and Belarus. Features of the Chernobyl accident and the situation at that time that shaped the consequences. The Soviet Union was a kind of totalitarian state. Everything was top-down prescripted. The Soviet Union experienced a number of nuclear and radiological accidents on the industrial and military objects and managed to keep them secret. Long time of radionuclides emissions, changes in wind directions and weather conditions. Long time for the state leadership to realize the scale of the accident. Use of the army for emergency and recovery works, and the ability of the power to mobilize huge resources. Explosions destroyed reactor and reactor building at night, April 26. This is picture to show the destructions of the reactor, and huge amount of radioactivity was released to the environment. Doses and effect on first responders and staff. As explosion destroyed Unit 4 reactor building, all the barriers were destroyed. Hot fragments of reactor structures, graphite lining, and fuel assemblies were thrown out the reactor core onto the roofs of nearby buildings and caused 30 fires. Firefighters who came were equipped to deal with the regular fire. The highest doses were received by the approximately 600 emergency workers, including the firefighters, who were on the site of the Chernobyl power plant during the night of the accident. The most important exposures were due to external irradiation, gamma irradiation of the whole body and beta irradiation of the skin. Doses of gamma irradiation of the whole body of the 134 persons for whom acute radiation sickness was diagnosed was in the range of less than 2.1 to 16 gray. Release of radionuclides and contamination field formation. The radionuclide releases from the damaged reactor continued for about 10-day period after the explosion and the graphite fire with varying release rates, radionuclides composition, and fuel particles contribution. Early release after explosion was dominated by the noble gases and volatile radionuclides, especially iodine and cesium isotopes. Later phases included less volatile material and fuel particles. Rainfall created major hotspots. On the larger distance from the radiological point of view, iodine-131 and cesium-137 were the most important radionuclides to consider because they are responsible for most of the radiation exposure received by the general public. The releases of 131 iodine and 137 cesium are estimated to have been to 1,760 and 85 petabecquerels respectively. Three main areas of the former Soviet Union, in total 150,000 square kilometers, with more than 5 million inhabitants, later on were classified as contaminated areas. Outside of the former Soviet Union, other large areas of Europe were also subjected to deposition of radioactive material. 45,000 square kilometers had cesium deposition levels ranging from 37 to 200 kilobecquerel per square meter. In the vicinity of the Chernobyl NPP industrial site, the levels of cesium-137 and strontium-90 contamination density reached 4 megabecquerel per square meter, or more than 1,000 curie per square kilometer. Here you can see the complicated picture of cesium contamination, the narrow western plum with high level of contamination, it enriched in fuel particles. Evacuation decisions. Evacuation decisions were made based on data on the radiation dose rate at the location. By the evening of April 26, the radiation dose rate in the city of Pripyat had increased from 0.14, 0.60 millisievert per hour to 5.4 millisievert per hour, and the decision was made to evacuate urgently. But the final decision was made in Moscow. Evacuation vehicles were waiting at the nearby to Pripyat locations for about 12 hours. After the decision was made, the evacuation of about 50,000 people was carried out on April 27, well organized during a 3-hour period starting at 2 p.m. From April 27 to May 2, the population was evacuated from the areas where the dose rate was 0.2 millisievert per hour or more, normalized to May 10. This is a 10-kilometer zone plus areas in the direction of the western plume. On May 2, the government commission made decision to evacuate population from the 30-kilometer zone plus the territory outside it, where the dose rate was 0.5 millisievert per hour, 0.05 millisievert per hour and more, normalized to May 10. The evacuation was carried out mainly during May. The last two settlements were evacuated from this territory in August 1986. In total, about 116,000 people were evacuated. On May 12, the decision was made on the individual dose limit of 100 millisievert during the first year after the accident for general population. The further evacuation should comply with this decision. Doses to evacuees. The average effective dose of evacuees from the city of Pripyat, which was accumulated by the time of evacuation, was 10.9 millisievert, with a maximum of up to 75 millisievert. The average effective dose of the population which was evacuated with a significant delay from settlements in the 30-kilometer zone was 15.9 millisievert. The maximum dose in this group was 214 millisievert. Due to insufficient assessment of the radiation situation on the evacuation routes, the doses of the population of the city of Pripyat, which were received during the evacuation, were within from 11 to 19 millisievert. The effective radiation doses of people evacuated from the Chernobyl accident area in the spring and summer of 1986 were estimated as an average of 33 millisievert, and the highest doses reached several hundreds millisievert. Delayed informing of the population about possible danger and measures to prevent them, and an imperfect regulatory framework for iodine prophylaxis led to significant dose loads on the thyroid gland of residents of the 30-kilometer zone, in some cases up to 5 gray. And this resulted almost entirely from drinking fresh milk contaminated 131 iodine in the first few weeks following the accident. The doses and effects on population. The average thyroid dose to the evacuees is estimated to have been about 500 milligray, with individual values ranging from less than 50 milligray to more than 5,000 milligray. For the more than 6 million residents of the contaminated areas of the former Soviet Union, it tests those with 137 cesium levels greater than 37 kilobecquerel per square meter, who were not evacuated. The average thyroid dose was about 100 milligray, while for about of 0.7% of them, the thyroid doses were more than 1,000 milligray. The average thyroid dose to preschool children was some 2 to 4 times greater than the population average. A map of the average thyroid dose to population is presented on this slide. The only clearly registered radiation effect on population due to Chernobyl NPP accident is the thyroid cancer among those who were children and adolescents at the time of accident. Using of army. From the very beginning, some military units had individual dose limits 0.25 sievert per work in the zone of accident and 0.1 sievert for one-time exposure, and some had limits for the time of nuclear conflict, 0.5 sievert, and even 1 sievert for the special work conditions. This led to doses over 0.4 sievert for 17 people. In total, 44 persons from a military contingent had recorded doses of more than 0.4 sievert. Analysis showed that only one of these cases might be considered as justified. Those limitations was the only principle of radiation protection which was used in military units activities in the zone of accident. Justification and optimization usually were not considered. Thank you for your attention.
Oleg, thank you very much for informing us on the immediate consequences of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident. Thank you very much. And together with Yuri, right? It was prepared by two of you.
We prepared together, yes.
Let's continue now with the immediate consequences of the Fukushima accident. And this will be presented by Nobuhiko Ban. And I understand this is a pre-recorded presentation.
I'm going to talk about immediate consequences of Fukushima Daiichi accident. First, I explain briefly what happened at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station after the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 were operating at that time, and they were automatically shut down when the earthquake struck. However, the earthquake caused breakdown of the power grid, resulting in the loss of off-site power supply. Subsequent tsunami caused failure of on-site emergency power supply and damaged the seawater pumps. Overheating of the reactor core due to these events led to melting of the nuclear fuel, so-called meltdown. Finally, these three units suffered containment failure, and the reactor buildings of units 1, 3, and 4 were damaged by hydrogen explosion. In response to the emergent situation, the government issued an evacuation order in the evening of March 11th for residents within 2 kilometers from the nuclear plant. The evacuation zone was gradually extended up to 20 kilometers as shown in the center panel. In the area within a 20 to 30 kilometers radius of the plant, people were ordered to shelter on March 15th, and the order remained in force until March 25th. On April 22nd, the 20-kilometer evacuation zone was redefined as restricted area, shown in light blue in the right panel. The liberate evacuation area, shown in blue, was an addition to the restricted area, and the residents were ordered to relocate in approximately 1 month. The area shown in orange in the right panel was designated as evacuation prepared area in case of emergency. People living in this area were advised to shelter or evacuate by their own means in case of another emergent situation. As a result of these protective actions, doses to the public were kept relatively low. This slide summarizes the external doses to people living in Fukushima Prefecture at the time of the accident. The left graph illustrates the relative distribution of doses for each district shown in the right map. As you can see, doses received in the first 4 months were less than 2 millisieverts for most people. The highest dose was 25 millisieverts, the value for a resident of so-so district. In nuclear accidents, early intake of radioactive iodine is a major concern, especially for children. Thyroid monitoring of approximately 1,000 children was conducted in the end of March 2011, but it was not sufficient to get a whole picture with accuracy. The ANSCARE compiled relevant information and estimated the distribution of individual doses using a Monte Carlo approach. This slide illustrates the estimated distribution of absorbed doses to the thyroid in the first year for all age groups. The left panel is the estimate for non-evacuated municipalities of Fukushima Prefecture, and the right panel for evacuees. While the average dose is 4 to 5 milligrays in both groups, around 0.2% of the evacuees were estimated to have received more than 100 milligrays. Based on these data, it would be fair to say protective actions were effective overall. However, it came with a high price. This graph shows the number of disaster-related deaths in the past 5 years. They are delayed deaths from injuries or illness caused or worsened in the emergent situation. Fukushima Prefecture suffered not only the highest number, but also the late occurrence compared to neighboring prefectures Miyagi and Iwate. This difference is mainly attributed to the deaths of the elderly and hospitalized patients whose condition worsened as a result of evacuation or relocation. As I explained earlier, restricted areas shown in red and yellow in the left panel were established on the 22nd April 2011. These were areas where the ambient dose rate exceeded 3.8 microsieverts per hour at that time. The situation has been changing as the dose rates continue to decline. But still, there are areas with rates higher than 3.8 microsieverts per hour, and the areas shown in red in the left panel remain restricted. This means that people relocated from there cannot return even now, after 15 years. And the reconstruction of these areas is still a serious challenge. Now let's turn to the exposure of emergency workers. Many workers from different professions were involved in emergency responses. Among them, on-site nuclear workers received the highest doses, and I would like to focus on their exposure. This chart shows the distribution of the effective doses of workers who are engaged in the on-site emergency work up to December 2011. As you can see, doses were kept within the annual limit of 50 millisieverts for the majority of workers. On the other hand, while an exceptional limit of 250 millisieverts was applied to those undertaking specific work, 6-step workers among them were exposed beyond that limit. Large part of the doses is from internal exposure that is attributed to inadvertent intake of radioactive iodine during an early period of the accident. This table summarizes thyroid doses for those 6 workers. The values are committed absorbed dose to the thyroid from iodine-131 intake. The values in the center column are recorded doses that were used to calculate the effective doses. The right column shows re-evaluated values for an epidemiological study, taking into account information and parameter values specific to each individual. The differences between the two columns are largely due to differences in thyroid volume from the ICRP reference value. The result of this reassessment raises concern about hypothyroidism in these workers, but no clinical symptoms have been observed so far. Before closing my talk, I would like to indicate some controversial issues that arose after the accident. First, radiological protection criteria. Various numerical criteria were introduced for the purpose of radiological protection. As I explained before, the relocation and returning was implemented based on the dose rate of 3.8 microsieverts per hour. There has been debate over the validity of this value, especially for elderly people. Another dose criterion, 0.23 microsievert per hour, was used to determine the areas for the decontamination program. A question is raised as to its cost-benefit performance. It also brought about another issue, how to deal with a large volume of removed soil. Restrictions on the distribution and consumption of contaminated foods were effective to reduce exposure from ingestion. However, setting very strict criteria resulted in an increase of food items labeled as contaminated, which led to persistent harmful rumors of Fukushima products. Another important issue is the medical thyroid screening. As part of Fukushima Health Management Survey, the screening has been conducted for individuals who were aged 18 years or younger at the time of the accident. While a substantial number of thyroid cancers have been detected, most of experts consider that the excess is due to the extensive use of the highly sensitive ultrasound screening. This situation caused controversy over the significance and objective of the screening program and ethical accountability for its continuation. Let me conclude this talk. In the Fukushima Daiichi accident, doses to the public were kept relatively low. However, it came with a high price, as symbolized by the deaths of the elderly people during and after the evacuation. After all, protective measures against radiation were effective, but adverse effects of those measures were substantial. In particular, socioeconomic impact was significant. One final point. The accident was unprecedented and caused the situation difficult to address. But it was the loss of public trust in the government and experts that made the situation further difficult and complicated. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was the presentation of Nobuhiko Ban on the consequences of the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. And with this, we finished the first part of the presentations, which was on immediate consequences of the accidents. And we are continuing now with the part dealing with the lessons learned. And I'm happy to pass over to Simon Bufler, the Vice Chair of ICRP. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Werner. So as I said, we're now turning attention to longer term and perhaps wider consequences of these two very unfortunate accidents. And I think many of you will be aware that they are ongoing concerns and issues at both sites. And, as time has moved on since the actual occurrence of the accidents, the situation is dynamic and has changed. So it's it's going to be very interesting to hear. I think it's 4 presentations we have considering both the Chernobyl and the Fukushima accidents and the longer term consequences. And first, we have Vladimir Berkovsky talk about dosimetry aspects and lessons for the ICRP system of radiological protection from Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents and in relation to nuclear terrorism. So, Vladimir, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and I will share my screen. Let's discuss the dosimetric aspects. My name is Vladimir Berkovsky. I'm a member of the ICRP Committee 2 and also work for Ukrainian Radiation Protection Institute and also in National Research Center for Radiation Medicine, Hematology and Oncology. Definitely, these 2 accidents have substantially impacted on the ICRP work, on ICRP logic, ICRP protection system. And today we cover topics on key aspects of the dosimetry in these 2 accidents, the shape of current and previous shape of ICRP systems, and challenges posed by these accidents and future events like nuclear terrorism, military attacks of nuclear installations on the ICRP protection system. So my colleagues already presented the details of the dosimetry aspects of these accidents. Just let's highlight and compare them. Chernobyl accidents characterized by high steroid doses in children and adolescents, where iodine-131 entered the food chains and especially through the milk, fresh milk. While in Fukushima, we observe lower deposition density than in Chernobyl, and in most locations, those to members of the public dominated by external exposure to deposited radiocesium. And the peculiarity of these 2 accidents really in the formation of the pathway of the doses, timing of releases, spatial distribution of releases, spatial distribution of ground deposition, geographical features, environmental transfer conditions. It was spring, but different phases of spring, different vegetation development, and implementation of protective actions actually substantially shape the outcome of these 2 accidents. During the Chernobyl accident, the release lasted about 10 days, initially dominated by noble gases and volatile radionuclides such as iodine and cesium. But explosion also dispersed fragments of irradiated fuel, technically spent fuel, and in the late phases, exposure was associated with less volatile materials and fuel particles. Rainfall contributed to formation of hotspots. Actually, it's valid for both accidents. During Fukushima accidents, multiple releases occur from 3 units, as you heard, during several days, and during the first phase of the Chernobyl accidents, volatile radionuclides, particularly iodine and cesium, prevail in the source term. However, land deposition was lower than in Chernobyl, with much of radioactive materials dispersed over the ocean. Because evacuation and food and water control limited early ingestion, those 2 members of the public were dominated by external exposure to deposited cesium, as we discussed. In both accidents, a large number of recovery workers were involved, and tissue absorbed doses for some of them substantially exceeded tissue threshold for tissue reactions. And you can see, so for Chernobyl, it's 500,000 recovery workers over many years, and very last activities in this area in high dose rate areas during the construction of a new safe confinement actually finished just a decade ago. And just in this work, late phase work, more than 17,000 individual workers, family names, were involved and monitored for contamination predominantly by the transuranic elements, which in those late phase was real serious concern in such conditions. In Fukushima, it's less numbers of workers, better control. Obviously, experience of Chernobyl was used during the Fukushima, during planning and development. Actually, ICRP system evolved over this time. And again, I highlight here the high doses, and keep in mind, this is organ absorbed doses, not effective dose. Effective dose, not really good quantity for emergencies. We'll discuss it later. Regarding the unscared public exposure, unscared give us these numbers. Just doses to thyroid. It's a huge range from few milligrays to more than 5 grays, and it's more than several hundred evacuees, children, receive these doses. Because of concern of steroid exposure, in Ukraine, actually in former Soviet Union, we performed a number of direct measurement of steroid. We used rather non-dedicated equipment like geological survey meters, but this equipment and these measurements were invaluable in later interpretation and dosimetric support of epidemiological studies. A number of PhD works performed just for the recalibration and interpretation of original raw measurements with non-dedicated equipment. So this is lesson that we may have a number of exposed individuals among general public, and what is important, a number of children were involved. And this was impulse for the development of and revision of ICRP dosimetry system and approaches. Before Chernobyl, actually, ICRP system and national protection system were focused on adults predominantly. And even in ICRP publication 40, for example, we had this statement, no need to consider selecting special groups like pregnant women, the neonatal or young infant for treatment differently from adults. This was statement before Chernobyl. Obviously, Chernobyl push to reconsider this approach, and over the several decades, ICRP Committee 2, a task group for dosimetry, spent a lot of efforts to develop new, much more advanced, more sophisticated, age-specific dosimetry system, which incorporates up-to-date anatomy, physiology, and biokinetic models together with computational phantoms. We still work on this. All serious work is general public actually under the work, and the first publication on public intake of radionuclides just published last year. And we're still working on emergency aspect of this, because emergency it's very special issues, like we need much more than in routine conditions. Emergency dosimeter for in utero exposure. After Chernobyl, evidence suggested significant fear-driven rise in medical-induced abortion, and a number of countries reported this. This underscores the need for explicit assessment of in utero exposure rather than relying on adult estimates and transposition of these numbers to in utero exposed individuals. Honestly speaking, despite of this really its old story, just recently, last week, we got this one. This slide shows the news page of the reputable Ukrainian news agency, and obviously that we still have misconception about dose and radiation risk, and even among medical professionals and scientists. Such misunderstandings obstruct trustworthy communication and sound decision making during the radiological emergencies. It also emphasizes that importance of continued development of both scientific and plain language ICRP documents. Educational materials from ICRP are crucial and will be expected in future definitely. Actually, ICRP after Chernobyl recognizes all these in utero issues, developed a set of really comprehensive set of materials on in utero exposure. Publication 88 provides dosimetric models and dose coefficient for assessing exposure, and the forthcoming publication will expand available materials with focus on emergency dosimetry. ICRP dose criteria for medical exposure clarify when pregnancy termination is not justified or requires case-specific consideration. However, despite all these efforts, in current set of materials, we have gaps, and especially in emergency management in relation to in utero exposure. And definitely, this is ongoing work. ICRP Task Group 120, for example, is working on these issues and prepare already a set of new set of materials. Concern about breast milk contamination arose after both Chernobyl and Fukushima. The absence of dose estimation models led to poor risk and communication and avoidable breastfeeding interruptions. ICRP publication 95 addressed these issues and provided dosimetric models and dose coefficient for dose assessment in such situations. And future ICRP updates by ICRP 120 and ICRP Task Group 112 will give more materials and advices with regard to this breast milk feeding issues. Since Chernobyl, the ICRP dosimetry system for workers also has substantially evolved from simple non-recycling biokinetic models and focus on the annual limit of intakes, derived air concentrations, United States systems, towards sophisticated and comprehensive system which cover all available materials and includes recycling and renucleate element-specific models. When biokinetic consider individually for each progeny within the body, and voxel, mesh phantoms, and comprehensive monitoring guidance. This layer system for protection of workers, responders, provide us a tool and accurate dose assessments and for design of protection strategy reflect advance in science and technology over several decades. The ICRP dosimetric resources comprise electronic databases and tools are available from dedicated ICRP web page. I welcome all of you to visit web page to use these resources. Most of them are free of charge, and you're welcome to look and use them. What could be recommendation for improvement of the ICRP system, dosimetry system? First of all, obviously from all previous publication and what we already discussed, that in case of emergency, the effective dose not is the best quantity to describe the conditions and plan response to provide medical support for affected individuals. We need substantial shift in emergency dosimetry towards the organ and tissue-specific absorbed doses. Developing the ICRP tissue-specific absorbed dose coefficients will provide important input for critical protection strategies. And ICRP 112 is working on this. Committed effective dose also a very special quantity, and all of us have to recognize that this nice quantity for long-term protection in normal condition, in planned exposure situations, it may be used probably even in transitional phase, in existing exposure situations, but in emergencies it can be really misleading for internal exposure, obviously, because by nature, by definition, it's integrate those over substantial period of time. And for example, for plutonium, less than 1% of tissue doses delivered within the first months after exposure. Hiding distinctive dosimetric signature of accidents behind a single effective dose quantity severely weakens decision making. The ICRP, it's representative person concept is used for demonstrating compliance and optimization in planned exposure situation. It's very useful, it's logic and widely used. However, in emergencies, it overlooks individuals who may receive much higher doses because of statistical definition of the representative person, when 5% quantile is out of consideration. And in emergencies, it's really important, and most affected person could be just overlooked. Future ICRP recommendations should emphasize the need to consider the most exposed individuals and those distributions, rather than just one number and just one concept representative person. The quantity projected, delivered, averted, and residual doses over specific period of time are key quantities for emergency management. And I will remind you that projected doses prospective estimates of doses expected to be received by you over a specific period of time in the absence of protection actions. Delivery dose is a dose that is actually received by individuals, or you estimate that it will be delivered. And averted dose, it's what you actually avoided. Residual dose is a tail dose after protection measures have been implemented or after decision to not implement them. And these four quantities really needed, unfortunately, not readily available from current ICRP materials. Everything which we published till now is rather long-term integration quantities, and it's definitely a gap in existing dosimetry system for emergencies. And ICRP task group 112 working to fill these gaps, and datasets which ICRP 112 will provide going to cover these gaps. What is important that criteria of ICRP dosimetric criteria should be formulated in these terms. Again, it's not always obvious currently what quantity, what in criteria, and it's our advice to be more specific and clearly specify those associated with one of these quantities in terms of criteria, in terms of assessed doses. And I mentioned several times ICRP 112 that it's mandate to develop dosimetric dataset and tools for assess doses in radiological emergencies. New datasets should consider harmful tissue reactions, stochastic effects, and should be situation specific. Datasets will include radionuclide specific tissue absorbed doses, dose coefficients, and biocide based dose quantities. It will be also supported by software that enable assess and estimation of doses. This is example of future new SRP viewer, which similar to what we already published and available from website. But here is much more detailed presentation of doses. Actually, the raw materials is dose rates, and such presentation gets stored inside, permits integration over average period of time, which give us full flexibility to assess all these four quantities which we discussed, and to give details for the design of protection strategy, establish dosimetry criteria for decision making, and for medical management of radiation casualties. The dataset and tools for external exposure will provide will include the simple tables which can be used in field without any computer tools, just laminated piece of paper, and it will be a layered, tiered system of assessments. Some datasets will need the involvement of computational tools, computers, and the top layer, the highest level, most complex layer of assessments, actually is direct use of Maxis software, which task group now currently developing. And this software will permit you detailed estimation of individual specific emergency doses in rather complex geometrical conditions. So it's actually what we had and have now, but what is important is the needs for future. Obviously, the events of recent few years, the nuclear terrorism or recent decades, starting from London, the tea drinking towards the large-scale hostile behavior of some states, pose definitely new challenges for SRP dosimetry system. The threat and source term range will be really broader, from nuclear detonation, military attacks on or sabotage on civilian nuclear installations, medical research and industrial facilities with large inventories of radionuclides. It should be highlighted that those assessments in such situation must support life-saving decision and medical management of mass casualties. Also, it's worth to mention that responder security and defense forces and maybe large portion of population groups involved in national defense may operate under operational necessity and amid dominant non-radiological risk and health for health and life. This completely new scene, actually never considered directly by SRP. However, obviously there is a demand on this for civil defense, for just defense of countries, and it will be recommended to consider experience of civil defense forces, security and military forces. Like they already have those status categories, action levels for medical assessments, and biopsy, triage, decontamination, decorporation thresholds. And it's worth to establish this system on international basis to harmonize current national approaches and to have consensus on this topic. So this really threats, and just clarify this illustration about the damaged new safe confinement or destroyed Unit 4 of Chernobyl. Huge hole because of military attack of Russian on this installation. And lower photo is the hole in the roof of mentioned hole of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, largest in Europe nuclear power plant, with sixth gigawatt reactors. Also, here we have statistics of the events reported to IAEA database of malicious acts, and you can see that it's rather a large number of such events. All these need dosimetry for emergency. Thank you for your attention.
Vladimir, thank you very much for that comprehensive presentation. We're now going to turn to a different topic, consequences for the environment and learning for the ICRP system protection. And this will be provided by a duo, so Nicole Martinez, who's a main commission member, and David Copplestone, who chairs Task Group 105 at the moment, and is also a member of Task Group 99. So Nicole, David, I'll hand to you. I'm not sure who's starting, perhaps.
It is me. Thank
Okay.
you. Simon, does it look okay from your end?
It does, yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, hello, everyone. I'm happy that you're here. Thanks again for joining us today. I'll be starting off by setting the stage with a brief review of the ICRP's approach to protection of the environment to give context for David's discussion on the big picture research findings from Chernobyl and Fukushima and what we've learned. At the end, I'll pop back in and say just a few words as a kind of forward look at potential evolution of environmental radiological protection. The primary aim of the system is broadly to contribute to an appropriate level of protection without unduly limiting desirable human actions. That aim is supported and informed by the pillars of science, ethics, and experience. And indeed, we're seeing today examples of what we've learned from a scientific or technical standpoint, but also from a practical standpoint. What works, what doesn't, where there may be gaps. And it may not always be explicitly labeled as ethics, but we have a thread throughout about what we value and why we're doing what we do. We want to do more good than harm, to be fair, to respect each other and our experiences, to exercise good judgment. All of that underlies the system of protection. And in that, we have different protection endpoints depending on what we're talking about. Right now, our focus is on the environment, specifically the natural environment. Protection endpoints for the environment are different than that for people because for people, we're largely focused on individuals. Of course, we care about public health on the societal scale, but we think about that in the context of what's going on with individuals. On the ecological side, we're more concerned with the broader whole. So we want healthy ecosystems with robust biodiversity. There are exceptions, but for the most part, we're not going to be too concerned about a problem with a single animal or a single plant if the broader community is thriving. Thus, relevant effects would be early mortality, reduced fitness, impact to fertility, things like that. A quick note is that you may notice in the ethical principles highlighted in ICRP Publication 91 for the environment are that some specifically focus on the environment itself, while others highlight the connection of people with their environment. Because environmental contamination can impact both the environment and people who live there. That latter bit broadly falls under people protection, but I will circle back to that connection towards the end of our presentation. When it comes to the practical management of protection, radiation exposure is rarely the only thing going on, so the approach to protection should be a graded approach that broadly considers the prevailing circumstances and is commensurate or proportionate or consistent with the level of risk, whatever your favorite way to say that is. And there are several ICRP publications that describe such an approach for demonstrating protection of non-human biota in the natural environment. And of course, the experience of Chernobyl informed that. The approach is analogous to that for humans, and that we have reference entities that serve, as the name suggests, as points of reference for protection. Parallel to reference person, we have reference animals or plants, or RAPs, for protection of the environment. There are 12 RAPs originally specified in ICRP Publication 108. These were selected pragmatically with a variety of considerations like availability of data, geographical spread, resonance with the public, but it's not intended to be a commentary on the value of this set versus other types of wildlife. So if your favorite animal is not on this list, that's okay. It can still be your favorite. Derived consideration reference levels provide a numerical point of reference. These are dose rate bands for RAPs where detrimental effects could occur. These bands can be used to support optimization of protection, again, supporting a graded approach that considers the overall circumstances, including the exposure situation, whether planned, existing, or emergency, although today we're in the realm of emergency and existing. Consideration should be given to all reasonable actions, including no action, because it may be that proposed actions do more harm than good. So, with all of that at the front of our minds, let's talk about what we've learned from Chernobyl and Fukushima. And I will turn it over to my colleague.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. Great, and hi everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about the consequences for the environment from our understanding of the accidents and what's happened. I think it's important to note, though, that in 10 minutes or so, I can't do justice to the huge body of environmental research that's been undertaken since the time of the accidents, both at Chernobyl and at Fukushima. Instead, what I'm going to do is focus on the learning points that can help us to develop our methods and our guidance for assessing the impacts of ionizing radiation within the international system of radiological protection across those planned emergency and existing exposure situations that Nicole's just mentioned. Now, you may be aware of the wide range of studies that have been carried out in Chernobyl and Fukushima following the accidents, and they span effect studies covering from molecular and genetic changes through to reproductive effects and to impacts on species abundance, populations, and indeed entire ecosystems. For example, following the Chernobyl accident, there were studies that found damage to reproductive organs in rodents that led to reduction in population sizes. And there were other reported studies that looked at localized crashes in things like soil invertebrates, such as earthworms, in highly contaminated areas. Although it's important to note that by the mid-1990s, many of these populations were already showing signs of recovery. And I point out these ones in particular because one of the endpoints of protection for the environment is looking at population level impacts and whether the population levels are sustained. It's important also to recognize, though, that the loss of species with key ecological roles like earthworms, even in short periods of time, they can actually have impacts on the overall ecosystem structure and functioning because of their roles in the case of earthworms for decomposition, for example. However, more recent studies at Chernobyl are showing a different picture. They show the presence of iconic apex species with populations that are expanding. And some of the images that you can see on this slide come from camera traps that were deployed during a project within the Chernobyl exclusion zone back in 2016 and 2017. And here you can see species such as martins, raccoon dogs, badgers, foxes, wolves, and elk, all in the exclusion zone and all surviving and doing well from what we can tell. Other research shows that these were supported through a diverse plant community and abundant associated invertebrate fauna. So the ecosystem appears to be functioning correctly. And that's an important point to note when we're trying to take the learnings from these findings into our system of radiological protection. Next slide, please, Nicole. So what are the key lessons from these accidents is that we need to understand the highly dynamic situation immediately after an incident. In this early phase, very high acute exposures can overwhelm biological repair mechanisms, leading to severe impacts on individuals, including mortality. And those consequences can persist over the short and longer term, and that can be different for different types of species. So we've got different responses from different species. And although many of the species that we see now are showing visible recovery in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, there are still important questions about how we use these data in radiological protection, particularly when it comes to incorporating them into the assessment criteria that we might apply, such as the DCRLs that Nicole's just mentioned. And I'll come back to that on the next slide. And some of the questions that we have are practical. For example, how confident can we be that the observed effects are from radiation alone, rather than other environmental factors at the time of an accident? How others, are more ethical and perhaps are relating to what's happening to individuals within these populations. I mean, one of the questions, when you look at the long-term studies that are showing these populations increasing, one of the studies that comes back to me, one of the questions that comes back to me is, Are these populations increasing simply because of the absence of people and resources are then plentiful and reproduction is being successful, allowing more of the young to reach a breeding age, which is how the population is being maintained? But what if the radiation exposure is actually leading to early mortality, for example, of those individuals? So they're dying younger than they would otherwise. So what are the implications of that when we're trying to understand the impacts on our environment? Finally, when we have a look at the scientific literature itself, there's not always consistent in terms of the information coming out from the studies. Some studies report major declines in certain species, while others show increases in the same or similar populations. And that pattern from the terrestrial side can be seen in a diverse range of organism types, ranging from invertebrates to the large mammals. Next slide, please. So the DCRLs that we have mainly been derived from laboratory studies on the effects of ionizing radiation. And those studies provide the evidence base for comparing our wildlife dose assessments. And they've largely been using laboratory conditions and studies because they're more controlled and avoid the confounding factors that we often see within field studies. And this approach was set out in ICRP publication 108. But one of the key questions raised by the Fukushima accident was how applicable these DCRLs are to real-world situations and how the advice given during an incident could be improved. And I think that reflects some of the questions that are appearing in the Q&A that we'll no doubt come back to later on. And this study by Takada and Snyder address this by comparing the wildlife dose rates from the post-Fukushima studies with the DCRLs from publication 108. And in this figure here, you can see that some of the estimated dose rates fall within or below the DCRL bands, while others greatly exceed them, particularly immediately after the accident. And you can see that if you look at the figure, because that's usually the bars in each of the reference animal and plant categories to the left of that category. And that's probably due to the presence of the short-lived radionuclides in that early phase of the accident. Some of the other findings that came out from this type of work were that the authors also noted that aligning the DCRLs with the higher taxonomic levels rather than at the family level. So when you look at the reference animal and plants, they're all defined at the family level of taxonomy. It could actually make them easier, though, if we can actually more broadly apply them as a comparison criteria. So using terms like mammals instead of deer and rat, for example, and I'll come back to that shortly on the next slide, please, Nicole. Thanks. So in ICRP publication 108, the data on the radiation effects focused on the species that represented the family taxonomic level for each of those reference animal and plants. So if I use the duck as an example, there are about 170 species that we use to represent that reference duck. And that often means that the available effects literature might be more limited because we're looking at that smaller group of species to represent the reference animal and plants. The evaluation that was done in publication 108 also relied on expert judgment and used those broad dose rate bands defined by orders of magnitude that you'll be familiar with and that were in the figure that Nicole presented a few minutes ago. More recently, though, Task Group 99 has been reviewing and updating the DCRLs by using a broader taxonomic grouping. So, for example, moving from the reference duck to the higher level of class of birds and trying to see how that would actually help us to explain and apply and allow for guidance to be used on their application of these DCRLs within the different exposure situations. The other thing that was done is that much of the available laboratory data comes from high, short-term or acute exposures. And so as a result of that, a significant amount of the information could not be used directly in the original DCRL derivation because their DCRLs are designed for those more chronic exposure situations that we're interested in trying to manage. And so TG99 also transformed the acute laboratory data studies into comparable chronic data sets using a mathematical approach that I'm not going to describe here. But this and the broader taxonomic groupings allow for a larger data set to be used in the derivation of the revised DCRLs. And then what we've been doing is using the field data from Chernobyl and Fukushima to actually check these DCRLs and to see what's happened when we apply them in practice. Next slide, please, Nicole. So in Task Group 105, we are reviewing the guidance on how the DCRLs can be applied, whether that's the family level based approach from Publication 108, or the higher taxonomic groupings developed within Task Group 99 across planned emergency and existing exposure situations. And currently, the advice in ICRP Publication 124 distinguishes clearly between those exposure situations, with planned exposure situations where we're looking to deliberately introduce radioactive sources into the environment, where you can look at the dose estimates and compare those to the bottom of the DCRL band so that you avoid any likelihood of deleterious effects. But when it comes to situations like Chernobyl and Fukushima, we need to think about how you can use those DCRLs in a more qualitative manner to support dialogue and possible ecological consequences, and how, when you transition from the emergency situation into the existing exposure situation, how they can be used to help to optimize protective actions from a radiological protection perspective. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because the other aspect of this is around emergency preparedness and thinking through what might actually happen given different accident scenarios. In TG 105, we've also been using case studies, including those from Fukushima and Chernobyl, to actually think about how environmental protection has been addressed in past situations, both that involve radiological and non-radiological contaminants, and to think about the wider consequences for the environment from those case studies. And a key part of that work has also been testing the Publication 108 and Task Group 99 DCRLs by comparing them with estimated dose rates to different wildlife groups. And the table here shows how the DCRLs, whether from TG99 or from Publication 108, can be compared with those case studies. And here you can see that the TG99 DCRL bands are no longer those order of magnitude, based on those order of magnitude values. And in some cases, the lower boundary has increased, and in other cases, has decreased relative to the Publication 108 DCRLs. That's not unexpected. In Publication 108, the lower bands were tended to be more conservative for the more radiosensitive groups, such as mammals, birds, and pine trees, compared to what was observed in the effects literature. And conversely, when we look at the more recent studies, especially thinking about more radio-resistant groups that have been studied more recently, such as bees and earthworms, what we see is that some of the numbers have DCRL bands have actually come down based on those latest effects data. And the table goes on to compare those maximum calculated maximum dose rates for each of the case studies with the Publication 108 and TG99 DCRL levels, where we can see what's actually happening when we use these different criteria. Often we see no change. So if you look at the table for mammals and grasses, you'll see that nothing has changed, because usually the calculated maximum dose rates are either the same for the mammals. They're either below or above or in the same band as the calculated DCRL values. Sometimes you'll see, for example, with the birds, when you go from the go to the TG99 DCRLs, the calculated dose rates have actually increased. And so you see that the calculated maximum dose rates are actually now lower than the DCRLs. And in a small number of cases, the TG99 lower boundary has been reduced. So earthworms is the example here, where you can see that we've gone from 400 to 50 micrograys per hour based on the effects literature, meaning that the dose rates now exceed the DCRL. So overall, the move to the TG99 DCRLs changes a few conclusions, but it does affect specific groups and highlights where assessment outcomes may need closer scrutiny. And that's an important point to take forward in the future. Next slide, please. And so overall, when we think about the TG99 DCRLs, they offer greater flexibility in mapping representative species to the assessment criteria. They're based on a wider evidence and they're broader wildlife groupings and a statistical approach, and should provide more robust criteria for interpreting assessment results in the future. Next slide, please. And so to conclude this part of the presentation, our work is informing those new guidance for environmental dose assessment, particularly when it comes to demonstrating protection of both people and the environment in a more holistic and harmonized way. And we're considering this guidance in the context of those planned emergency and existing exposure situations. And some key points to take forward for you to think about are that often when we're looking to take protective actions in any of those exposure situations, but particularly perhaps in terms of environmental protection in an emergency, we need to be aware that those actions almost inevitably will alter the environment in some way. And in some cases, as Nicole mentioned earlier, doing nothing might actually be a best option if we want to ensure that we do more good than harm in the environment. And by being able to do these calculations, we can now start to demonstrate what's actually happening when we're actually making those decisions. And the case studies from Chernobyl and Fukushima in particular have highlighted the importance of considering not just radiological impacts, but also the range of non-radiological impacts and different drivers. So whether that's cultural, economic trade-offs, and so on. And so we need to start thinking about using multi-criteria decision-making to help us with that clear and transparent stakeholder engagement about the kinds of impacts that we're seeing. And overall then, this allows us to demonstrate whether those protective actions do more good than harm across those different exposure situations within the international system of radiological protection. And we're drafting further guidance on these points at the moment, so hopefully will be an opportunity to discuss that with you further soon. Okay, now back to Nicole. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And so we end basically as we begin, circling back to the aim of the system. We can see that people, animals, and the environment are interconnected. This is one of the major points that David made in his discussion. We impact our environment impacts us in a variety of ways. Lessons from both Chernobyl and Fukushima really drive that home. David also mentioned from these lessons learned is the need for robust and holistic perspective when considering the environment. So considering the interconnected whole as opposed to individual pieces separately. And one lens we can use for that we saw mentioned briefly earlier, and that is sustainable development. Motivated by moving toward the next set of general recommendations, a fit-for-purpose reflection on the system of protection identified sustainable development and quality of life as considerations likely deserving more explicit attention, and there's now even a dedicated paper led by Werner digging into the relationship between the system and sustainable development goals, and you can see that linked in the bottom right. Among the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we even see explicit mention of conserving, protecting, and sustainably using the environment. Protecting our environment in its widest sense is an essential pillar of sustainable development, both for ethical reasons and because human well-being and socioeconomic development depend upon ecosystems that are healthy and perceived to be so. To that end, we have several task groups reflecting on the environment. I don't have it listed here, but there's also a working party focused on sustainable development. This figure is not intended to be exhaustive, but it is intended to illustrate the intentional integration of consideration of the environment throughout the system and the broad scope of questions being asked as we move forward. And the last thing I'll highlight as an example is Task Group 125 on ecosystem services. Nobuhiko mentioned earlier the negative perception of Fukushima products and perhaps unintended consequences of protective actions. And one of the things this Task Group 125 is exploring is how our actions can impact ecosystem services, how potentially we can include that in our broader consideration of the environment. Thank you so much. And with that, I will turn the floor back to Simon.
Thank you both, Nicole and David. Talking in some detail about the environment. It's always nice to hear that. So now we're turning attention to effects on humans, and again, in common with the presentations, considering both the Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents, we have Mark Little from ICRP's Committee 1. So, Mark, over to you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organiser of this meeting for inviting me to speak today. I'll be talking about Chernobyl and the Fukushima accidents, looking at the Fukushima accident health consequences, and I'll be concluding that at the moment, we don't have very much in the way of assessments of radiological consequences of the Fukushima accident. So most of the rest of the talk will be about Chernobyl. So I'll be looking at Chernobyl cancer studies first, in particular studies of thyroid cancer, hematological malignancies, and breast cancer, and then turning to the non-cancer Chernobyl studies, looking at specifically cataract, cardiovascular disease, and transgenerational effects. I'll then be drawing some conclusions and links to, and then discussing links to the ongoing work of various ICRP task groups. So the Chernobyl and Fukushima reactor accidents are easily the two most serious nuclear accidents to have occurred so far. You've heard some of this information already, but 40 years ago, yesterday, a steam hydrogen explosion occurred in reactor 4 at Chernobyl, and this reactor was largely destroyed, and there'd been no secondary containment. A meltdown and fire occurred that released radioactivity most over the next 10 days or so. On the 11th of March 2011, there was a simply a colossal earthquake off the coast of Japan. The resulting tsunami resulted in cooling loss to the reactors 1 to 3 at Fukushima, which suffered meltdowns, and the resulting hydrogen explosions breached containment, releasing radioactivity to the environment most over the next 20 days. As you can see from this table to the right, the radioactive releases from Chernobyl are much more serious than for Fukushima. In particular, note the 3 radionuclides given in red, which are the most significant radionuclides for human health. As to say, iodine 131, cesium 137, and strontium 90. So, in terms of the impact on humans in the environment, Chernobyl was also much more significant than Fukushima. As this table shows, that there were, for example, there were 134 cases of acute radiation syndrome following Chernobyl. And 28 of these 134 went on to die very sadly quite soon after, within a period of months. There were no cases of ARS in Fukushima. The numbers of people that evacuated were also and relocated were much more substantial for Chernobyl. The effective doses to cleanup workers. 61,000 man-sievers vastly exceeded the total for Fukushima, about a hundredth of that figure. The dose to the population, again, comparing the population of Europe rather than the population of Japan, but much more significant. So the measures taken by the Japanese government meant that the population exposure to Japan and indeed to workers at the Fukushima plant was minimal, so there are very few workers who receive more than 100 millisieverts, about 174 out of about 20,000 workers who worked at cleaning up the plant. However, the non-radiological impact of the earthquake and tsunami at Fukushima has of course been considerable. The tsunami and earthquake directly caused about 18,500 deaths, and some of these people were swept out to sea and are still missing. There was, as you've already heard, a substantial increase by about 50 to 200% of deaths in the evacuated elderly in nursing care, likely a result of disrupted care arrangements. There have also been documented increases in mental health problems, elevated blood glucose and hyperlipidemia in Fukushima prefecture, likely due to psychosocial consequences of the tsunami accident and relocation. There have been a few studies of what may be radiation-related health effects. I mean, one that attracted some attention was by Suda and colleagues, published about 10 years ago, assessing thyroid cancer prevalence in children under the age of 18 via high-intensity ultrasound scan in 9 areas of Fukushima prefecture up to the end of 2014. The authors of this study concluded that an excess of thyroid cancer has been detected in Fukushima prefecture and is unlikely to be explained by a screening surge. However, this study and this specific conclusion has been much criticized by other people, other experts. And I think that other studies to date of radiation-related human health effects in Fukushima have been, I think, largely uninformative. And so from this point forward, I'll concentrate on what may be learned from the Chernobyl nuclear accident. So turning first to the cancer studies in Chernobyl. So there have been two major thyroid screening studies in Ukraine and Belarus, which are the two most heavily affected former constituent republics of the USSR, shown on this slide. And the thyroid doses are substantial, exceeding 30 gray for some people in all studies, in both studies. The risks that you can see on this slide are, in general, somewhat less than those that have been seen in for example, in a study of childhood exposed groups exposed under 200 milligray, published a few years ago by Jay Lubin, shown at the bottom of the slide. There's also been a screening study of thyroid cancer and nodules after exposure in utero in Ukraine. The doses are via ingestion of iodine 131. There's also some postnatal dose in this study. The doses are moderate to high, up to about a bit over 2 gray, as you can see, and these are mostly high dose rate exposures, at least for the people exposed at the highest level of dose. And as you can see, comparing the risks in this study with the risks that have been derived from the Oxford Survey of Childhood Cancers, looking at in utero exposure, they're generally below that level of risk, the risk per gray. So turning now to some studies of thyroid cancer in cleanup workers. These are all case control studies that were conducted, and the thyroid doses were a mixture of external and iodine 131 and from some other radionuclides, span a fairly high range up to a bit over half a gray. Mostly at low dose rate. These dose estimates were obtained via the Radiological code, and based on interviews conducted some time after the accident, as you can see, 25 to 30 or so years after the accident. The risks are somewhat more than those that have been seen in an adult exposed group in the atomic bomb survivors, as shown at the bottom of the slide. Although just because of the fact that the confidence intervals in many cases include 0 in both cases, they are at least statistically compatible with the findings in Ukraine. And in all studies shown here, the doses were adjusted for dose error. Turning now to leukemia after exposure in utero or in very early childhood. This is a case control study conducted in 3 constituent republics of the former USSR, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And shown here are the risks, and the figure to concentrate on is the one right at the bottom of the upper panel, the all country excess relative risk per grey. And as you can see, it's the risk is a bit higher than, but statistically compatible with those obtained in a pooling study of childhood exposed groups under 100 milligray. There is the doses here are moderate. I'd say under 400 milligray, both for cases and controls, and all at low dose rate. Doses are also mainly external. And so turning now to hematological malignancies in an older group of these are cleanup workers. There have been 2 main studies conducted here. The first was looking at hematological malignancies in a group of liquidators in Belarus, Russia, and various Baltic states. And the second looking at the same sort of things, but in Ukraine. The doses are generally all via external gamma. They span a sort of a range up between 0 and about half a gray, mostly at low dose rate. There's what's slightly interesting here is the fact that there's an increase in risk of chronic lymphocytic leukemia in both studies. This has also been seen in excess in the Japanese atomic bomb survivors, but not in many other groups. The risks are slightly higher than, but statistically compatible with those in the atomic bomb survivors, as shown at the bottom of the slide. Turning now to breast cancer, there's been a single study, single reputable study done by Rifkind et al., published about 6 years ago. The doses are mostly via external and some ingested cesium-137, with doses to under half a gray to both cases and controls, and low dose rate. The risks in this study are very much higher than, but statistically compatible with those in the Japanese atomic bomb survivors for sort of a comparable, all age population, as shown at the bottom. So, to summarize these cancer studies, apart from the thyroid screening studies, the in utero one and the two main childhood exposed screening studies. Most of these Chernobyl studies are for low dose rate exposure, though in some cases there is the doses are quite high. The cleanup workers in the UCRAM cohort, although the dose rates were mostly low, there is a small group who received in excess of 25 milligray per day for certain periods. So it's very likely that some got more than the 5 milligray per hour, which is the what might be considered a sort of the threshold between low and high dose rate. So in general, these show elevated risks, which are comparable with those from the high dose rate studies, which I've shown for comparison. So, and there's little evidence of any sort of therefore dose rate sparing or in these studies. So you might conclude that dose rate effectiveness factor is there's no evidence of it being greater than 1. Right, turning now to the non-cancer studies in Chernobyl. Looking first at a study of cataract in the cleanup workers in Ukraine. This was published nearly 20 years ago now by the late Basil Vogel. This slide shows the cataract risks. This study is unusual in that it's got a very high quality dosimetry. The eye lens beta and gamma doses were derived by a combination of questionnaire. That they also had for some groups of the liquidators film badge doses, and they also used tooth enamel EPR doses. So the dosimetry was derived using a combination of these three, and the doses in general are low to moderate. Most are under 0.7 Gray, and all at low dose rate. And as you can see, comparing the excess odds ratios per Gray with those in the atomic bomb survivor data, as taken from a recent paper by Here et al., the risks are generally comparable. Turning now to cardiovascular disease in cleanup workers, the doses are generally on the low side, under about 0.3 Gray, and all at low dose rate for the most part. Now, these studies, it has to be said, are problematic. Certainly the Russian morbidity studies, as shown in the two top studies on this table, are that they rely on Russian Ministry of Defense registry data. And there's a registry, the NRER registry in Russia, which is about which not very much has been published. The study is for this endpoint. It's unfortunately lacking all lifestyle information. There have been some much smaller studies in Ukraine which do have the lifestyle information, but these small studies are also problematic, I would say. The risks are somewhat higher than those seen in a recent meta-analysis, as shown at the bottom. And it should be noted that this meta-analysis includes the Russian morbidity studies. Finally, there's been a study looking at transgenerational effects in cleanup workers and evacuees from the 30-kilometer exclusion zone in Ukraine. So this was a parent offspring trio study assessing de novo mutations in offspring. The preconceptional doses, which are all low dose rate, are quite substantial, in excess of up to 4 gray for some fathers and over half a gray for some mothers. Partly as a result of this, well, result of this and the size of the study, it's got substantial statistical power, as you can see, greater than 99% to detect a doubling dose of 1 gray. But nevertheless, the results are essentially null, as you can see from the confidence intervals in this plot, in this table. But you could derive from this what the lower bound, as it were, on the doubling dose could be, and so for paternal gonadal exposure, they would be about 45 gray, and from maternal exposure, 11 gray. So these obviously vastly exceed the ICRP assumed doubling dose, which is largely based on the 7 locus mouse data, which is a doubling dose of 1 gray. So the conclusions overall, I'd say as yet, little has been learned from the radiological about the radiological consequences of Fukushima, where it's clear that population exposures are much lower than for Chernobyl, but also there's been limited follow-up, much more limited follow-up from Fukushima. Obviously, we've only had 15 years since the accident. This may soon change, so watch this space. For Chernobyl, the cancer studies, the exposures are mostly at low dose. The thyroid screening studies are the exception. There's little evidence of that risks are much lower than seen at high dose rate. So in other words, the dose rate effectiveness factor is there's no evidence for that being greater than 1. There is weak evidence, in particular, of thyroid cancer risk following in utero exposure. For non-cancer, these are mostly moderate dose and low dose rate studies, and there's been studies showing an excess risk of cataract and cardiovascular disease, but the cardiovascular disease studies may be of low quality. This rather suggests for both cataract and cardiovascular disease that the ICRP assumed threshold, as in report 118, of 0.5 gray for tissue reactions may not be quite low enough. And there's no evidence of transgenerational effects with the implied doubling doses of at least 10 gray. So the Chernobyl studies provide a unique contribution to available knowledge on radiation-related health effects, particularly valuable because the dose rates are mostly low. And there are obvious links to the ongoing work of various ICRP task groups, in particular ICRP task group 118, where the evidence from various studies of beta emitters, in particular iodine 131, will obviously enable estimates of relative biological effectiveness to be produced for that endpoint. It also has implications for the work of ICRP task group 121, and in particular the largely negative findings for the study of transgenerational effects and thyroid cancer in utero. Also, I think for ICRP task group 123, the findings of excess risk of cataract and cardiovascular disease have obvious implications for assessments of tissue reactions. And I think that's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for sort of giving an overview of those human health effect studies. For the final presentation in this sort of block, we are turning attention to societal and socio-economic impacts and implications for the ICRP system. And this is, again, a sort of a double-headed presentation with Thierry Schneider, chair of ICRP Committee 4, Michiaki Kai, who is a former main commission member. So, Michiaki and Thierry, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Simon. I'm a Michiaki Kai, former MC member, and I was also the chair for the development ICRP publication 146. Today, I will present lessons learned regarding societal and socioeconomic consequences of implementing the ICRP system of radiological protection. And I will talk about the first half of our presentation, and Terry Schneider will talk about the second half of our presentation. This presentation has been supported by Nobuhiko Ban and Toshimitsu Honma. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. In 2020, ICRP published Publication 146 based on the Chornobyl and Fukushima accident in terms of radiological protection. This publication highlights key lessons learned from Chornobyl and Fukushima accident, which is a particular focus on managing intermediate and long-term phase. Now ICRP is currently reviewing and revising the general recommendation. This topic is an important part of our ongoing work. Today, we would also like to propose further cooperation in this area. Next slide, please. From both Chornobyl and Fukushima, we learned something very important. The experience both accident clearly showed after accident people feel lost. They often lose trust in authorities and experts and gradually lose control over their daily lives. Another key point is that returning to the original situation is usually not possible. Radioactivity cannot be completely removed, and many social consequences are irreversible. As community break down, leading to divisions and complex social dilemmas. At the same time, socioeconomic system must adapt to a very different context. Next slide, please. Both accidents showed very similar societal impact due to radioactive contamination. The presence of radioactivity upset people's well-being and often lead to population decline due to evacuation and relocation. Protective action also change how people live and work, and even affect relationships. Also side effect from the contamination and compensation policies. We also see a collapse of trust in authorities and sometimes even the disintegration of families and communities. In addition, affected areas often face stigma, and the products from those regions may be rejected. Unfortunately, stigma toward people from these areas is also serious issues. Next slide, please. Nuclear accidents generate significant fear and anxiety about radiation. Studies have shown increased level of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, especially among responders. For example, in Fukushima, about 9% individuals experience psychological distress related to radiation anxiety. In Chornobyl, long-term increase in suicide rates were reported. It suggests persistent mental health challenges. There are also strong concerns about children's health, especially regarding possible hereditary effects. Next slide, please. Economically, nuclear accident can severely affect agriculture and fisheries, as well as critical infrastructure such as transport and utilities. Maintaining business activity becomes difficult for both employers and employers. In addition, lifestyle change due to protective action can have long-term health consequences. These include reduced physical activity, poor diet, limited access to healthcare. As a result, increased risk of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and other chronic conditions have been observed. In fact, some studies suggest the health risk from lifestyle change may exceed those from radiation exposure itself in terms of loss of life expectancy. Next slide, please. Decision about evacuation sheltering among most difficult. Evidence suggests that evacuating elderly people is not always best option. In some cases, evacuation from nursing homes posed greater risk than radiation exposure in Fukushima. Similarly, prolonged sheltering without proper support can also be harmful. In Fukushima, unplanned evacuation vulnerable population may have caused more harm than benefit. Therefore, decision must consider all risks, not just radiation, and aim to maximize overall well-being. We need to take a balanced approach in terms of all risks. Next slide, please. Ending protective measures is also very challenging. Authority must determine when action is no longer necessary and communicate this clearly. It requires confidence. Decision about allowing people to return home require careful dialogue with affected communities. This process should involve open dialogue with affected communities. People need clear information about living and working conditions, as well as radiological situation before making such decisions. Next slide, please. Key concept here is a radiological protection culture. Radiation protection culture refers to the knowledge and skill that allow people to make informed decisions about radiation exposure. This includes understanding measurement results, developing personal reference point, and taking protective action independently. It also allows people to evaluate effectiveness measures implemented by authorities. The goal is to make individuals as autonomous as possible in managing their situations. Communication, dialogue, and co-expertise are essential for developing this culture. Next slide, please. Restoring economic activity in affected area is not always straightforward. It requires structured socioeconomic program to support community resilience. Governance mechanisms are essential to rebuild trust, ensure long-term sustainability. Reconnecting with consumers and maintaining vigilance over time are also critical. Most importantly, local community must be actively involved in the recovery process. Next slide, please. To conclude my presentation, several key lessons emerge. First, we must consider all health impact, not only radiation, but also lifestyle change. Second, evacuation decision must balance multiple risks, overall well-being, especially for vulnerable populations. Third, ethical consideration are central. People should be empowered to make informed decisions. Finally, communication, dialogue, expertise are crucial to avoid misinformation, psychological harm. Strengthening community ties, developing radiological protection culture are essential for long-term recovery. Next slide, please. There are relevant ICRP publications. These are available free of charge from ICRP website. Try to download. Thank you very so much. I will now turn it over to next speaker, Terry.
Thank you, Michaki, and good morning, good afternoon, all of you. I will now focus on the current process of reviewing and revising the system of radiological protection and how we can embark, and we currently embark, the lessons from Chernobyl and Fukushima. Next slide, please. So I will not go too much into detail, but I would like to highlight 5 topics that we are currently investigating and for which Fukushima and Chernobyl clearly influence the way we will produce the new general recommendations. The first point is considering tolerability of risk and looking for reasonableness. The second one is on principle of justification. The third one is on the application of exposure situation. The fourth one is on sustainability of protective action and sustainable development. And the last one refer to ethical value. Next slide, please. So with regard to tolerability of risk and reasonableness, clearly Chernobyl and Fukushima accident highlights the importance of selecting good reference level, appropriate reference level to guide the optimization and to set up what we can call the border between tolerability and not tolerable risk. And then, of course, we need to take into account due consideration for the different phase of the accident, from emergency to recovery. Based on that, we have to embark the uncertainties due to exceptional circumstances, and then, of course, it impacts the search for reasonableness level of protection. The other point is the focus of stepwise process. There was a question in the chat mentioning how to adapt progressively the management, and then clearly the dynamic of the accident, the different phase, clearly influence this stepwise process. The other point, of course, and Michiaki Kai clearly highlighted that the decision-making process relies on multi-factor consideration. The stakeholder involvement is a crucial point for in allowing sustainable level of protection, and then ethical value is quite important, with a focus on the respect of dignity and autonomy of citizens and to ensure decent and living and working conditions. Next slide, please. With regard to justification, we have a task group currently working on this topic, and then with Fukushima notably, we broaden the scope from prevention and mitigation of health detriment of radiation to maintenance and improvement of well-being under exposure situation. And then among the key aspects are again ethical consideration, sustainability, stakeholder involvement, link with optimization, and the protection strategy for emergency. Next slide, please. Then, of course, the Fukushima accident and previously Chernobyl accident clearly highlight the question of the transition from one type of exposure situation to another. At what time we can consider that we can move from emergency to existing exposure situation. And then we need to consider the different phase of the accident, from emergency to recovery, to anticipate the evolution of the management in time and space and to better address that. And with regard to that, the selection of reference level need to be adapted to each phase of the accident to reflect the characteristic of the situation and of course to address the expectation of local community. In addition, in this task group 127, there are large discussions about the classification of workers and responders and the application of the system. How to deal with that? We have seen in the presentation at the beginning from Chernobyl the key challenge for liquidators and responders. Next slide, please. With regard to sustainability, so we have the question of sustainable development, which was highlighted by Nicole Martinez previously. The key point is the sustainability of protective action. Then we have a key role of justification from the transition from emergency to recovery. I will not read again all the paragraph from publication 146, but then you need to consider at what time you can shift from one position to another and how far we can we can be in position to maintain suitable living and working conditions. And the condition and means for recovery, which are highlighted in publication 146, is that the characterization of the radiological situation and the system of radiological monitoring for people on the environment are sufficiently well developed. And then again, the question of co-expertise process, which need to be put in place and to allow to involve local stakeholders in the decision-making process. Next slide, please. With regard to ethical value, you may have in mind that ICRP published in 2018 a publication on 138 on ethical value, and then we are currently with TG 129 addressing some specific application, and one of the application is dealing with emergency and recovery situation. In that perspective, there is a clear need to define and apply the concept of well-being, how to address that, not only to measure the dose, but to consider all the factors in terms of well-being for local population. We need to have feedback experience on decision-making and communication on health effect, how to address that, and how to discuss effect at different level of exposure, considering the current knowledge and uncertainties, including the effect for future generation. We also need to analyze the challenge related to equity in decision-making processes, and then how to apply the optimization in this perspective. We had some discussion on vulnerable group, how to deal with that. And then finally, we need to have to survey the perception of inhabitants on their autonomy and investigate the deployment of co-expertise process. Next slide, please. So to conclude, Chernobyl and Fukushima accident largely challenged the application of the system of radiological protection with regard to the selection of relevant radiological criteria, the application of optimization and addressing low level of exposure, the question of transition and lifting of protective action, the question of addressing long-term issue, and the link with sustainable development and the role of stakeholder and ethical value. Currently, ICRP is in the process of reviewing and revising the general recommendation, and this is an opportunity to embark some lessons learned from Chernobyl and Fukushima, and to better address social and human dimension, ethical issue, complexity of risk management and risk governance, and sustainability of protective action. Thank you for your attention, and I give back the floor to Simon or Werner.
Thank you, Thierry and Mishiaki, and to all the speakers in all six speakers in this session. So I think it's clear to me from what we've heard that learning from the two unfortunate accidents is going to sort of shape radiological protection in a number of different areas going forward, and that will sort of play out over coming years. But now to consider maybe some of those implications in a bit more detail, we're moving to a panel discussion, and apologies for having eaten into the time a bit. So I'm handing over to Chris Clement, ICRP's secretary, to, I think, introduce the panel and moderate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I invite all the panelists to turn on your videos at the moment. You can leave your microphone off until you're speaking. So welcome everyone to this moderated discussion part of our webinar. We're tackling the large question of, are we better prepared now? You've heard a lot already about the activities that have gone on so far, but where are we? As Simon said, I'm Chris Clement, Scientific Secretary and CEO of ICRP, and we have a distinguished list of panelists. Before I introduce them, let me just mention, so that they're prepared, that the format is each of the panelists will speak for 2 or 3 minutes just to give some few key points that we'd like to explore under this "Are we better prepared now?" question, and after which I'll pose some questions to the panel, in part based on their interventions and in part based on some of the comments and questions received in the chat online. There's no way we'll get to all of the questions. There are many, but we'll do what we can in the time available. So our panelists today are Werner Room, ICRP Chair. You've met him already. Miroslav Pinak, Janat Kenbayeva from WHO, Bernard Le Guen from IRPA, Evgenia Ostromova from IARC, and Farid Shanoun from UNSCEAR. So let me invite Werner to speak first. Please go ahead, Werner.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much to all the speakers for setting the stage for this podium now, for this discussion. And let me start with what we just heard from Thierry, and remind you that ICRP is currently in the process to review and revise the system of radiological protection. So this is very timely because now we are looking at all the things we should improve. And of course, the lessons learned from the Chernobyl accident and from the Fukushima accident provides a unique opportunity. And we already heard from our speakers that there's quite a lot to be learned, and there is quite a lot for the system to be improved. I mean, it doesn't mean that the system doesn't work. It's robust and it works, but it can always be improved. And the lessons I learned from the presentations is, for example, that we really have to look after an accident, use an holistic approach. We heard that evacuation of elderly people led to considerable loss of lives, for example. This goes, if you like, beyond direct radiation action, but still we have to consider this. We have even lessons to be learned which go beyond Chernobyl and Fukushima, and this was mentioned, for example, by Volodymyr, who highlighted that we are now in changing times. We are living in changing times, and we have now additional challenges: nuclear terrorism. We saw armed conflicts in areas where there are active nuclear power plants. So this is another issue we have to consider. We have also learned, and this was quite obvious, I think, from the Chernobyl accident, a lot of studies on human health effects have been conducted, epidemiological studies on various cohorts, and of course, we learned a lot, we as the scientific community, but also we as the radiation protection community, we learned a lot from those studies, perhaps a bit less so from the Fukushima accident for various reasons, which might include a shorter follow-up so far and less radioactivity released and so on. Smaller populations affected. And we heard also, for example, that non-radiological impacts on the environment is an issue, again, which this calls for a holistic approach. So we have many other factors which may influence ecosystems indirectly after an accident. We heard of the exclusion zone where we have less human activities, which is beneficial for the environment, for ecosystems, for example. So there are different issues to be considered. And so it's really time now and helpful for us as ICRP if from such kind of discussions we learn and get input for our review and revision of the system, which I mentioned at the beginning. So I really hope that we get a lot of food for thought and to get back home and continue working on the next general recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Werner. Much appreciated. So now we move on to Miroslav. Please go ahead for your 3 minutes introduction.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. So it's my pleasure to be here. So I'm Miroslav Piňák and I'm head of the Radiation Safety and Monitoring section at the IAEA. I'm currently responsible for preparation of safety standards in all areas of radiation protection. To my history, I spent nearly 20 years of working in Japan, so I have this kind of inside information concerning being involved in radiation safety activities directly in Japan. And now I am already for 14 years responsible for implementation of the assistance programs to the Fukushima prefecture in the area of remediation, monitoring, and waste management. So to make it very short, so IAEA safety standards are basically developed on the robust scientific evidence and extensive international consultation. We just have been having a discussion with Dr. Professor Rooms and Werner concerning the necessity to build international safety standards and ICRP recommendation on the scientific evidence as the first and prime criterion. And to look into account not only scientific knowledge, but also on the possibility to implementability and effectivity to be consistent with the practices which are taking in particular situation. We have number of years, decades of global application, and this demonstrates that current system of radiological protection is robust, fit for the purpose, and has performed well across a wide range of exposure situations. We had several speakers here. Of course, there are always areas which needs to be changed based on the lesson learned. This was mentioned also by Thierry Schneider just before the panel. Changes in the system shall be based, among others, on lessons learned from the, for example, response to accidents, also like Chernobyl and Fukushima. On the other side, I would like to say that it's equally important to have the maintaining the system stability in place. Those who are using this in countries they need to have a sufficiently long enough time to adopt standards which are internationally advised, either ICRP, IAEA, or other organization, translate them into national legislation, and implement them in facilities and activities. And the stability is particularly important in emergency and accident situation. When standards are perceived as uncertain or in transition or being not consistent with each other, decision making may lack confidence in the system and default to the most conservative or lowest numerical values when adopting certain decision, which was exactly the case in Fukushima. Myself being involved in this kind of expert group advising government of Japan on this kind of decisions, it was quite difficult to advise on some optimized approach. There was no time to discuss scientifically these issues, and immediately in the absence of international guidance, the decision makers took the most conservative approach in order to ensure the confidence of and trust of the public, and also to be sure that we are doing our best in prevailing consistent situations or circumstances concerning to ensuring the radiation protection. Mr. Professor Nobuhiko Ban, who was speaking during 1 hour ago or so, he also said the various radiological criteria were introduced, and they were leading to setting too conservative criteria, which were probably not needed, and created, these are not my words, but someone already said they created more harm than good. There was also, I was looking on the chat question concerning different evacuation distance. Distance is recommended by US, a greater distance, and ICRP shorter distance, and so on. But certainly this decision is national authority, and it should be responding to the accident, the prevailing conditions which are inside. Still set an internationally advised, harmonized recommendation will be very useful and needed, and probably that would be good if ICRP or even IAEA take into consideration what will be the new documentations or recommendations or other materials prepared. Professor Kai also said about the need for having open dialogue with affected communities in an understandable way. They need to trust us what we are talking them. To make it short, 2 minutes is 2 minutes. International safety standards, I do believe, as advocated currently by IAEA, are relatively ensuring that if adopted properly, they secure the proper level of protection. But while scientific evolvement is progressing very quickly, we need to look what is happening and prepare for changing when justified and when the net benefit for safety actually prevails all this kind of necessity to be engaged in preparing changes of the standards. So I do believe that if in this way, IAEA will be able to contribute to maintaining a comprehensive and well-established international system for ensuring radiation safety. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Miro. Now we're over to Janat, please. From WHO, you have up to 3 minutes.
Unmuting myself. Hello, everybody. My name is Janat Kenbaeva. I am the WHO focal point and the technical lead on matters pertaining to radiation emergencies, preparedness, and response. I would like to elaborate a little bit on the question whether we are better prepared today and how Chernobyl affected and impacted their operational response, specifically pertaining to the public health aspects of that. I want to underline that the Chernobyl catastrophe was more than just a nuclear accident. It reshaped the global public health preparedness to radiation emergencies and also the trust in the institutions. Within months, 2 landmark conventions were adopted, as you know, Early Notification Conventions and Assistance Convention managed by the Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which ensure rapid notification and coordinated international assistance mechanism. This became a foundation of multilateral system, interagency system led by IAEA, where WHO has the key role on protecting public health in case of such emergencies. Also, to implement our mandate under these conventions, WHO has set up the Global Expert Network called RAMPAN, Radiation Emergency Medical Preparedness and Assistance Network, back in 1987, which now grew into a global expert network, largest and one of a kind in the world, which provides policy advice, training, and also technical assistance to WHO in case of radiological nuclear emergencies. Equally vital was the lesson on communication. Secrecy in 1986 bred panic and mistrust, and that taught the world that transparency is as critical as medical response to this type of emergencies. Further lessons based on health consequences of the accident were obviously related to the surge of childhood thyroid cancer because of contaminated milk consumption. And that adopted a global standard, and today it's basically a cornerstone. One of the cornerstones of emergency response is iodine thyroid blocking. Another lesson is setting the emergency preparedness arrangements based on the vulnerability. So modern arrangements, they all take into consideration that children, pregnant women, lactating women, chronically ill, these are vulnerable populations. The other lesson which I'd like to also mark on is the protection of first responders. As you know, those who responded, the firefighters and cleanup workers, in the first hours and days of the accident, they actually lacked the appropriate protection, and there were severe consequences. There were cleanup workers and firefighters who died and those who developed acute radiation syndrome. And one of the biggest shifts in the clinical protocol since Chernobyl times is that the bone marrow transplantation is no longer the method of choice. Today, the modern treatment of ARS, acute radiation syndrome, is based on the use of cytokines and growth factors. And these protocols are still valid. I also want to mention that there were long-term registries for the medical follow-up set up in 3 affected countries, and they became models for global health surveillance after nuclear emergencies, informing radiation risk standards. And already was mentioned that psychological impacts and fear and stigma and displacement of populations, they highlighted the need for mental health and community resilience as integral part of response. The other new things which emerged after Chernobyl was the role of civil society, of NGOs and movements and activists, which filled the gaps where secrecy failed to inform the community. So today we all recognize the importance of community engagement and a role of civil society. These lessons were quite important. And of course, there were many more lessons, but these are the points I wanted to highlight. And everything what came out of Chernobyl, in fact, was in a way tested during the response to Chernobyl and provided life-saving value of, underlined the life-saving value of these lessons. So overarching message is that preparedness is never finished. Each emergency teaches us to do better, and honoring Chernobyl's legacy means committing to continuous learning for better preparedness for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janat. Now on to Bernard from ERPA.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. About the question of experience and lesson learned from evacuation, I would say that following the Chernobyl disaster and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, those evacuations have deeply changed how nuclear emergency are managed. They showed that evacuation is not only a technical decision, but also a major public health and human challenge. I would say just 6 points. First point, speed versus information, how acting under uncertainty. One of the first key lessons is the need to act quickly, even with uncertainty. A Chernobyl evacuation was delayed, increasing exposure to significant radiation before being moved At Fukushima, it was faster, but sometimes confusing due to changing instruction. Today, rapid action must go hand in hand with clear and transparent communication to maintain public trust. Second point, preparedness and planning improvement. At both events, major changes were implemented worldwide. We mentioned predefined evacuation zone around NPP, but also drills, exercise involving population living in the vicinity of NPP. Stockpiling iodine tablets, or such as in France, pre-distribution since 1997. Also improve radiation monitoring system. It's true for environment, but also considering all emergency responder, not only workers and contractors, but also all responder, such as firefighters, police officer, and civil protection teams. So lesson is preparedness dramatically improve outcomes. I would like just to give an example about also the importance of risk. Risk is not the same everyone. We mentioned children and pregnant women, especially vulnerable to radioactive iodine because of the thyroid. This is why they must be prioritized for receiving stable iodine, but I would say if necessary. Experience has also highlighted the importance of measuring real exposure instead of relying only on distance from the accident. Authorities now aim to assess actual contamination, particularly in the thyroid and in the environment, to adapt their response more precisely. So stable iodine if necessary, and also not if it's not necessary, because there are other consequences, particularly after if we decide long monitoring. So in order to avoid over screening in this case, and also psychological effect if we decide this long monitoring for the family and for the children. Third, communication failure versus transparency, so public trust and institutional credibility. Chernobyl response was marked by secrecy from Soviet government. Residents were not informed about radiation risk. In Fukushima, the government of Japan communicated more openly, but sometimes technical jargon, and I also mentioned changing risk assessment, reduced public trust. And well explained by Mr. Nobuhiko Ban, public trust is a critical asset in emergencies. Once lost, is extremely difficult to regain and directly affect compliance with evacuation orders. So communication must be simple, consistent, and frequent. Fourth point, preventive education and drills. The lesson learned from both nuclear accidents have highlighted the importance of preventive education, teaching safety action and proper behavior to population living near nuclear power plants. Just for example, in France, we have organized specific campaigns and drills for the residents around NPP for learning reflex behavior in case of an accident. And as Mishaki explained, try to build a radiological protection culture. Fifth point is radiation risk versus evacuation risk. One of the most important insights, especially from Fukushima, is that evacuation itself can sometimes cause more harm than radiation exposure at low levels, and it was well explained for elderly people. This means decision must balance radiation risk with the risk linked to evacuation. The predicted dose of 20 millisievert is not the only parameter to take into account. As well explained, shelter in place may sometimes be safer than evacuation. And also transport, staffing, and medical continuity are critical. Six, long-term displacement and social impact. Chernobyl created a massive exclusion zone, displacing hundreds of thousands permanently. Fukushima evacuees face similar long-term disruption, so some areas have since reopened. But many residents never returned due to fear, loss of livelihoods or social ties, but also because they build a new life in another place. Lesson learned that evacuation is not a short-term action, but it creates long-term social and psychological consequences. Just before to conclude, as also Zanat mentioned, I would like to give you an example about international cooperation related to medical care. The importance of consensus and international consensus. We mentioned the 104 workers, liquidators in Chernobyl, and the 28 deaths in Chernobyl and due to acute radiation syndrome. So now we work clearly. There is a whole tradition of a French school related to acute related syndrome, but since 2009, we have a publication in Stem Cells. We have international guideline on acute radiation syndrome management, and in order to better integrate regenerative medicine, in particularly combining supportive care, cytokines, anti-infective therapy, transfusion with early stem cells-based intervention, and which may improve hematopoietic recovery and survival in severe cases. But also about research, what is very interesting to note is pluripotent stem cells as a scalable source for hematopoietic rescue. Recent advances in induced pluripotent stem cells offer a promising, potentially unlimited source of hematopoietic progenitors, standardizing protocols to reprogram iPSCs into functional blood cells could address donor shortages and enable rapid deployment in large-scale radiation emergency. So just an example, but again, my conclusion about Chernobyl and Fukushima, this demonstrates that evacuation is not just a technical decision, it's human, logistical, and ethical challenge. And again, the key takeaways is not only evacuate faster, but communicate clearly and honestly, protect the most vulnerable, balance risk carefully, plan for long-term consequences, and work about international cooperation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. Now over to you, Evgenia. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is an honor to brief you today on the efforts of the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, on the scientific learnings from the two major nuclear power plant accidents. But before doing so, please allow me to introduce myself very briefly. My name is Evgenia Straumova, and I'm a scientist of the Environmental and Lifestyle Epidemiology branch of IARC. Our agency promotes and coordinates international research on causes of human cancer, mechanisms of carcinogenesis, and strategies for cancer prevention. The agency is a special liaison organization of the ICRP, and I'm serving as IARC ICRP focal point. And also I'm a member of the ICRP Task Group 121 on the effects of ionizing radiation exposure in offspring and next generations. Research on cancer risks in the cleanup workers and general population after the Chernobyl accident remains among the top scientific priorities of the agency. And several key papers were published, including radiation-related risks of thyroid and hematological malignancies in cleanup workers of Belarus, Russia, and the Baltic states. And this study has been cited today by Dr. Mark Little in his presentation. On thyroid cancer, radiation-related risk, and the effect of iodine supplementation and stable iodine prophylaxis on the radiation risk in people exposed to iodine-131 under the age of 18 years at the time of the accident. We also monitor cancer incidence rates in general population of the most contaminated areas of Ukraine and Belarus by performing ecological studies using estimates of age-specific, Ryan average cumulative organ-specific doses. In 2017, IARC convened a multidisciplinary international expert group to develop recommendations on long-term strategies for thyroid health monitoring after a nuclear accident, based on the current scientific evidence, including Chernobyl and Fukushima research. This work was supported by the Ministry of Environment and the Nuclear Safety Research Association of Japan, and the recommendations were published as IARC Technical Report number 46 in 2018. In 2020, in The Lancet, we published the appeal for future Chernobyl research and the urgency for consolidated action.
IARC coordinated initiative, the Cooperation on Chernobyl Health Research co-chair, brought together key worldwide Chernobyl researchers and proposed a detailed and prioritized research strategy in agreement with relevant authorities in the affected countries. Due to an absence of funding, implementation of the research plans has to an unfortunate and untimely standstill. There is a need to turn this tragic experience into an opportunity to better understand the effects of radiation on human health. The last but not least, the United Nations General Assembly decided to establish an independent scientific panel on the effects of nuclear war under Resolution A/Res/79/238, adopted on 24th December 2024. As a result of the panel work, they will produce a comprehensive report, make key conclusions, and identify areas that require further research. And the report will be submitted to the 82nd session of the General Assembly in 2027. And IARC is represented in this panel, and we would keep you updated about the progress of this work in a timely manner. So, in conclusion, we believe that IARC's radiation-related cancer research continues to be useful and relevant to the ICRP work and mission and to the radiological protection of humans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evgenia. So to our last panelist, Farid from UNSCARE. Please go ahead, Farid.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Farid Shanoun. I'm the Deputy Secretary of the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, short UNSCARE. I would like to thank the ICRP for inviting UNSCARE for this online event and to discuss if we are better prepared now to protect the people and the environment in situations of radiological accidents. As you might know, in 1955, a decade after the foundation of the United Nations, the General Assembly established UNSCARE with the mandate to conduct assessments of exposure to ionizing radiation and its effects on human health and the environment. Today, UNSCARE is composed of senior scientists from 31 member states of the United Nations and normally meets once a year in Vienna, where also its secretariat is based. UNSCARE findings are disseminated to the General Assembly, the scientific community, and the public, and have served as a scientific base for ICRP's recommendation over recent decades. It is important to note that UNSCARE was engaged from early on in assessing the health effects of the tragic Chernobyl accident. As early as 1988, just 2 years after the event, UNSCARE published its first assessment on acute radiation effects among emergency workers and estimated global impact on radiation exposure, as you have heard today from several presentations. More comprehensive evaluations were assessed and published subsequently in UNSCARE 2000 and UNSCARE 2008 reports. Furthermore, following the 2011 accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station, caused by the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, UNSCARE carried out directly a full and detailed assessment of radiation exposures and potential risks. The results of this assessment were already published in 2014 and later on updated in 2021. All UNSCARE publications are freely available for download from our website. Finally, let me enforce that UNSCARE has been and continues to be strongly committed to responding rapidly and effectively in such unfortunate and serious circumstances. With this, I hope that you agree that we are today hopefully better prepared than 40 years ago. Thank you very much and looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Farid, and thank you to all the panelists for the initial intervention. As you've seen so far in this session, there's a lot to discuss, so we're not going to cover it all in the next 20 minutes or so. But nonetheless, let me begin with a question from the audience, and then we'll come back to some of the points raised by the panelists. And I'll go back to the very first question asked, it seems like some hours ago. So this is first for Werner, but others can make a comment as well. So Mikhail Balanov made a suggestion about let me just read it. Since predicting the health consequences of a nuclear accident remains a relevant topic, it would be advisable to prepare ICRP recommendations that could cover, for instance, key objectives, recommendations on dose and risk assessment, and so on. These recommendations could be incorporated into a future document, for instance, perhaps something that might expand on publication 146. Werner, what do you think about this idea as a generality? And then we'll get some comments from others.
Well, in principle, I think it could be a good idea. Of course, I am just the chair of ICRP. I am not the main commission, which is the deciding body of ICRP. But I think we should take this idea and bring it to the main commission. The main commission will have a meeting rather soon, and to discuss it. And we are open, and if it fits to our mission, which it does, I feel, and if it fits to our resources, I think we should consider this seriously. That's my very first take, of course.
Thanks, Werner. And as I know very well, and so do you, we have a huge body of work, so let's see if we can fit it in, but it's difficult. Everything's difficult now. We're very busy. Nonetheless, any other panelists have a comment on this idea? Go ahead, Bernard.
Yeah, I like the question because probably in the past we have a global approach related to nuclear accident. More and more we discuss about graded approach, but truly operational. Today, population are still treated too uniformly, and in reality, children, workers, and vulnerable groups such as elderly people have a different risk and expectation, and we need more differentiated. So just an example that we can provide more explanation about how to deal with a nuclear accident. And also, we must be cautious with long-term health surveillance, especially for thyroid cancer in children. I just mentioned previously, including studies published in the New England Journal of Medicine, shows that intensive screening can lead to overdiagnosis or overtreatment, as seen in Korea. So screening should therefore be targeted, not systematic, focus on individuals, on children with significant thyroid exposure, typically above 50 to 20 millisieverts. So it's also a part of the answer asked by Mr. Balonov to precise more how to deal with this question, but based on all the experience learned with the two accidents.
Thanks, Bernard. Would anyone else like to make a comment? And I can't see everyone's hand, so if you want to make a comment, just start speaking. No? Okay, good. So let me go on to another topic.
Sorry, I raised my hand.
Go ahead.
I want to highlight the good cooperation ICRP ANSCAR has. And if such a project is planned by ICRP, I think the involvement of ANSCAR will be crucial here, because it's not only about radiation protection, it's also about the consequences and the risk estimates. And I would say it's an overlapped mandate, and it would be really good to do such things in a coordinated manner. Thank you.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much. And I'll pause for a moment in case someone else's hand I wasn't seeing. Okay. I'd like to explore briefly, although it's a very complex topic, something raised by Bernard in a specific incident about, for instance, comparing radiation risk versus evacuation risk. But the bigger question is about trying to optimize in a very difficult situation, in a situation of a large nuclear accident. And it's not only about radiation risk and evacuation risk. There are 100 other factors. Would anyone like to expand on do you think we've advanced in any way to give advice on how we might manage this, how we might look at the large number of factors that impact the good or bad outcome of decisions on RP actions in these circumstances? A difficult question, I know. Go ahead, Miro.
Thank you very much, Chris. I just would like to bring one point to this. Radiation risk is quite complex issue, but in the case of accident and response to the accidents, as I had a opportunity to part of this discussion on site. So this radiation risk is just one factor which is going to be considered. And at that time of this discussion, that the decision needs to be done basically immediately when the question comes because of the evolving situation, there is no time for speculation. There is really need to have certain numerical value which advise. If those rate goes above this, you take this decision. But then it's not solely on this kind of factor. There are other factors. Availability of this kind of evacuation means, accessibility, the conditions of people who are going to be evacuated. So this needs to be taken in the complex problem and as a complexity, and it was taken like that. But relaxation of this numerical value, which are actually in IEA documents and I see in ICRP documents, is not a simple task. It should be implementable way. Those people who are making decision take decision in a complex. So if there is, let's say, 0.5 microsievert or whatever number is there, then you take a decision along with other factors which drives your decision. That does not mean that if I increase 10 times the value that people will remain staying there. Maybe it's not feasible. So those people who make decision needs to consider this in all complex picture. And I don't think that solving that changing in numbers of radiation risk evacuation criteria will solve the problem. So that's my entry into this. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much. And this points out another point. We'll come right to you in a second, Thierry. In my view, at least, RP is fundamentally a practical exercise. We do lots to understand the implications of our recommendations, but in the end, someone makes a decision and takes an action. So we have to keep this in mind. The end point is an action or an absence of an action, a decision. Go ahead, Thierry.
Yes, thank you. Just to continue on this topic, we have currently two task groups who are working partly on the application in case of accident and post-accident, namely TG 114 on tolerability and reasonableness. Beyond the framework for tolerability and reasonableness, there will be a chapter dedicated to emergency and post-accident, and clearly what was highlighted by Miroslav just before will be addressed. Similarly, the task group on exposure situation and categories of exposure is currently challenging what does it mean, how to apply the system in emergency and post-accident. So I encourage you to follow the result of the ongoing work of these two task groups, and that will be certainly some topic of discussion, and we will have also some debate about that in the next IRPA Congress, so that will be the opportunity to discuss this point.
Thank you very much, Thierry. Would anyone else like to expand on that point? Again, I can't see all your hands. Go ahead, Bernard.
Yeah. Very, very quickly, because I perfectly and I fully agree about the fact that it must be reflex, we must be simple. Yeah, but clearly, based on this complex situation, we need to move from a dose-centered approach to a holistic, differentiated, and long-term vision. Integrated also radiological protection with ethics, communication, and territorial resilience. Again, with Mishiaki presentation, I was really impressed because we need to move beyond a health-only perspective and address long-term territorial recovery. The return of population depends not only on those, but on jobs, services, and trust. Affected regions face long-term stigma and economic decline. So again, of course, we have to take a decision based after a nuclear accident, but we need to include all these parameters for the right decision, which is not easy, but just to say that this is important of an holistic approach about the decision maker.
Thanks, Bernard. Anyone else on this point? As I quickly scroll through all the little pictures. No? Good. Well, we don't have too much time left, but maybe we can squeeze in one more point. And maybe we can talk briefly about international cooperation. It's been raised a few times, and I think this event, in fact, demonstrates that it's going on. But is it getting better? Is it getting more robust? Is there more we can do, or should we do something differently? Any comments from the panel on this question? Go ahead, Janat, and after you will be Miro.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I believe that what we have in place is quite robust. The Interagency Committee for Radiological Nuclear Emergencies, where many of the present distinguished speakers are participating as representatives of these agencies. It is active. It meets every 18 months. We have a joint plan of international organizations where all the duties are described. It is a living document being regularly updated. We have interagency exercises ran every 4 years. The last one was last year and took place in Romania. So I believe the system is in place. Of course, there's always room for improvement, and I think the new challenges which are now emerging, which probably are less reflected in the existing international standards, there is always room for us to work together to address these challenges, such as preparedness for nuclear accidents during military conflict, for example, and the very new thing which is now emerging and everybody's talking about is artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. And these are very serious threats which the future humankind may have to really be prepared for, I think. Thank you.
Janat. So next, Miro, and then to Werner.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Just very briefly. So I don't answer the question whether we do better or not, because it would be type of self-evaluation, which I try to avoid. But I would like to say after the accident, particularly in Fukushima, there has been a large effort in order to communicate with other parties involved in this kind of radiological risk or radiological emergencies or the situation after. We enhance communication, and I do believe the current system, as Janat said, now is better prepared for responding for any this kind of potential questions. I don't say that's an accident. I hope there will be none, but the questions which we are receiving and continue to receive from various parties involved. We have now a system of standards and guides and other materials in cooperation also with ICRP, which are covering a large area of this kind of answers which are there. The only problem what we are facing is to explain properly, because there are number of areas which are not in plain language. They are not addressed to the general public. General public needs to be communicated by those who are actually in charge of communication to public. But we need to advise experts to take proper decision on the material which is currently and already available. Just for example, food and drinking water safety. Chris, you might remember in 2012 there was a meeting of our committee RASC, which actually task Secretariat of IAEA to prepare this harmonized approach on addressing food and drinking water safety, together with FAO and WHO addressing this. And we have now 4 documents which are actually harmonized to the large extent. We just need to bring them to the potential use and let's say advocate them to be studied before, because in the type of need of response, there is no time for study. You just need to take it. And this information is already there. So this is lesson learned, where international organizations should be more probably aggressive or proactively advocating to be ready for potential situation which will lead to questions. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thanks, Miro. Much appreciated. Werner, over to you.
Yes, thank you. You talked about international cooperation. Now, just let me remind all of us that the radiation protection system developed by ICRP is based on scientific evidence. And scientific evidence, that's at least my impression, is more and more challenged all over in many countries. Expert knowledge seems to become less important. Fake news boosted by social media become a challenge. And so this means to me that we should all stand together, that we should strengthen our collaboration because we are all on the same page. We all want to improve radiation protection based on scientific evidence. Not only scientific evidence, we heard more. There are many more factors, but also scientific evidence. We heard about miscommunication. Communication will be more and more important. We should speak. We should convey one message, but with many voices, and we have a lot of voices here. So I think in a broader perspective, even beyond radiation protection, international collaboration is really key. Thank you.
Thanks, Werner. We're getting close to the end, but Bernard, one last intervention. Go
ahead. Very quickly, 2 points, because I appreciate what Werner said about communication is now a core challenge, and in the era of social media, trust can be lost very quickly, and how to work closely all together on this point. Just to mention that from the perspective of IRPA, which has issued guidance on this, the role of professional is critical. They need support to communicate clearly, transparently, and to effectively counter misinformation, but not alone with all of us. And just if I have just 10 seconds, just to provide an example of very simple cooperation, international cooperation on the field. Some NPP in France are close to a border, and today when we organize exercise, for example, for Chornobyl, which is close to Belgium, we organize in common Belgium and France together, and for Cattenom with Luxembourg, for example. So how this kind of exercise involve not only one country but several countries, and that's true also with OECD and NEA with specific nuclear exercise which can involve several countries.
Thanks, Bernard. Okay, I think it's time for me to sum up, which is almost impossible given the wide set of topics we discussed, but maybe just let me pick out a couple of points from this panel discussion. A few that I found very important were the discussion on international cooperation. As Werner said, this is a cornerstone of success. If we don't cooperate, it just won't work. Another point is about expert knowledge and globally, I would say, reduced reliance on science in decision-making. Not everywhere, but everywhere to some extent, for sure, which can lead to decrease in confidence, decreases in trust, which is not a problem only for radiological protection by any means, but it's a broad social problem around the world that I have no idea how to tackle, to be honest. One of the points I really liked from Janat was when you mentioned, Janat, that preparedness is never finished. And I think this is crucial. We often see after accidents, maybe not of the scale we're talking about here, lessons are learned, they're put in a folder somewhere. And then when it happens again 10 years later, we look at the folder again without actually learning the lessons or integrating the lessons into our daily business. And maintaining the procedures that are necessary to manage when bad things happen. So I think the reminder that preparedness is never finished is a key point when we're talking about large nuclear accidents in particular. And the point made by Miro early on about this balance that has to be made between changing, improving, let's say, updating the system radiological protection and the practice of radiological protection versus stability. Both are important. How do we balance is not always clear, but it's a decision we have to make. And I don't mean we as an ICRP, I mean as the RP community. How do we balance this need for stability so that radiological protection can be implemented not only in rich countries, but also those with less means, where it's much harder to make changes, but for the whole world. So with those few points, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. It was a very good discussion. Clap, clap, clap for all of you. Thank you very much. And we pass on to the final section, which is back to Werner Room for closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. I would also like to thank our podium participants and our speakers, but I would also like to thank all the audience for joining. It was a long session, 3 hours, without any coffee break. Can you imagine that? I think I never had that. So thank you very much for joining. I think we should stand together. This was almost my final word a couple of minutes ago. International collaboration, as Chris said, is the cornerstone of everything. And we should stand together. We are on the same page. We have the same goal. We want to improve radiation protection. This also includes, of course, that we want a stable system, but also an up-to-date system. And with this, I would like to thank you once again, and I would like to finish the session. Thank you all. Bye-bye.